Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I recognise that today's headlines from this House will be on the Chancellor's autumn statement. I'm afraid the Chancellor has only made things worse for those whose lives are the subject of my adjournment debate. But I'm very pleased to have secured this adjournment debate because it is on a subject which is so often overlooked by Chancellors, Prime Ministers and many others. I am talking about the adoption process, Madam Deputy Speaker, the process by which children are removed from their birth parents and placed in the care of and ultimately adopted by parents other than their birth parents. This year's John Lewis Christmas advert gives a moving and positive representation of the adoption and care sector and brought welcome attention to the topic. And I'm not ashamed to say it also brought tears to my eye watching it on the train to the North East last week. And I commend the work of John Lewis with Action for Children on the advert. Children are the most vulnerable in our society. It's imperative that the child's interest be first and foremost in the care and adoption process. Indeed, let me go further and say that the care and adoption process can only be successful if it is child-centred and if everyone involved upholds this principle. But, Madam Deputy Speaker, this does not mean that birth parents should go without support. For every child adopted, there is a parent or parents who have to go through the process of losing their child. These are often parents in challenging and difficult circumstances, some of whom may not have the social or educational skills to easily navigate the complex adoption process. The process is traumatic for many. It is not in the child's interest to leave those parents without help. For their sake and for the child's, a child placed in care and or adopted may one day want to make contact with their parents, as is their right.
On that point?
Of course, I'll give way.
Can I commend the Honourable for Newcastle upon time for bringing this forward? And I spoke to her beforehand. But does the Honourable agree that often when children are not told that they've been adopted or information about their birth parents is kept hidden, this becomes a distressing or can become a distressing occurrence for adoptive parents, which also can cause resentment and in some cases even complete breakdown of relationships between the adoptive parents and the child?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his intervention, and I think he makes a very good point in that I would always recommend honesty and transparency in everything, and I think that there can be challenges where that is not followed. And again, as I said earlier, everything that should be done in the long-term interests of the child.
Will my honourable friend give way?
I'll certainly give way.
I'm really grateful to my honourable friend for being able to secure this debate around birth parents, because we know that birth parents often experience a lot of trauma, not least in the age of social media, where they can have contact which isn't supported with their birth child. And as a result of that, even more trauma can occur. And that's why the APPG on adoption and permanence published a report looking at strengthening families, including the voices of birth parents. Does she not think that it's so important that those voices are heard throughout the adoption process?
Well, firstly, as well as thanking my honourable friend for his intervention, I want to commend the work of the APPG on adoption, and also to say that that is the heart of why I call this debate, is to enable more exposure and voice to birth parents, and I think she is absolutely right in that. It's a subject which is not discussed enough, and I think it's clear that the experience, if you talk of that contact between children and their birth parents, is more likely to be more constructive if the birth parents have been supported through the adoption process and beyond. And that is why, particularly, I want to bring to the House's attention the work of a unique local charity in my constituency that provides invaluable support to birth parents. And the reason I say unique, Madam Deputy Speaker, is that Families in Care are a charity for birth parents, set up by birth parents. They are, to my knowledge, the only charity in the country which offers the services that it does. They were originally set up in 1986 by birth parents of adopted children, a parent-led support group. They then became a charity in 1992 and employed their first part-time worker. Since their beginning, their delivery model has been nurturing, non-judgmental, holistic, and most importantly, done in partnership with birth parents. Now, my honourable friend, the member for South Shields, had a university placement with this charity, and she's unable to be here this evening, but wanted me to pass on that she gained invaluable experience from her time with families in care. But before I say more about families in care, I want to discuss the difficult climate in which they operate. Removing a child from their parents should be a last resort, but that last resort is necessary, all too necessary, and it happens all too often. Over 80,000 children are currently in care in England. This is an all-time high. That means more children who need our support and more birth parents who need support. And the erosion in early help for vulnerable families in recent years, and particularly since the Conservative government came into office in 2010, has been shocking. More than 1,300 Sure Start centres across the UK have closed since 2010, a loss that is not nearly matched by the paltry commitment to open family hubs in just 75 locations. And I hope the Minister recognises the impact of that on the adoption and care system. My constituency in Newcastle has been hit particularly hard. Newcastle has seen a 20% increase in the number of looked after children between 2018 and 2021 alone. The North East Child Poverty Commission this year's report this year shows that the North East has the highest proportion of looked after children in England at 108 children per 10,000 children. And according to the directors of the North East Children's Services, this means, and I quote, the North East is in a vicious cycle with levels of demand causing pressure across the system and spiralling costs. Analysis from the University of Liverpool shows that the rise in cared for children has coincided with rising child poverty. And given that under the Conservatives, the North East has become the child poverty capital of the country, this is particularly concerning from us. And we are once again, after today's announcements, faced with real terms public sector cuts, where local authorities, already under enormous pressure, and working people are being expected to bear the burden. Newcastle City Council will have to make the £25 million they spend on children in care go further, placing yet more pressure on the care systems and parents themselves. But this is not the only issue, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are inequalities in adoption rates and the number of children coming into care, both by levels of deprivation and ethnicity. In 2020, in Newcastle, white children left social care settings for adoption at double the rate at which non-white children left social care settings for adoption. Gypsy, Roma and traveller groups are also overrepresented in the care system and are more likely to experience low rates of adoption and fostering compared to national averages. It is for this reason, Madam Deputy Speaker, that the work of families in care is so important. The charity provides free, independent and specialist advocacy, support, counselling and education for birth parents who are involved in child protection and care or adoption proceedings in Newcastle. Families in Care has been supported since its establishment by Newcastle City Council. However, they remain independent of the local authority, working in collaboration with the Council's Children's Services to provide an invaluable mediating service. I visited Families in Care in October this year, and I was struck by the atmosphere of support and welcome and warmth. And I learned of the bespoke care, mediation, well-being support and counselling that families receive during all stages of the adoption process, before, during and well beyond court proceedings. This bespoke care includes Len, their therapy dog, who I was fortunate to meet. I'm told his nickname is Redleg, a reference to his beautiful ginger coat, and apparently also to his politics, but as I do not speak Husky, I was unable to verify that. Families in Care also offer learning and development session, mediations, therapeutic art, meditations and weekly mental health drop-ins over a cup of tea for their parents. And I saw one poignant and beautiful work of art, a bright collage of art and craft materials coming together to create a tree wrapped in a rainbow. And it carried the powerful message to parents saying, and I quote, "Nothing is impossible. The word itself says, I'm possible." Madam Deputy Speaker, it is through being rooted in the community, having been established by parents going through the adoption process, that the charity is so well placed to speak up for birth parents. And I wanted...
I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The question is that this House do now adjourn. Onwurah.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I was just saying that I wanted to share with you some of the experiences of birth parents to give a greater voice to them. My first story comes from a constituent, a mother and a survivor of domestic violence and coercive control during pregnancy. I heard how in her particular case, social workers did not help her mental well-being, as she had to re-explain her situation to 6 different social workers. This, she said, was re-traumatizing. But she told me how her situation was totally transformed by Families in Care. She told me, and I quote, "I felt totally alone before meeting Families in Care." I was also contacted by another mother who felt overwhelmed by the shame and guilt associated with going to court. She felt ostracized even by her own family, but Families in Care gave her someone she could cry with, someone she could lean on for support, someone she felt was truly in her corner. Madam Deputy Speaker, parents journey together with Families in Care and they work on a peer-to-peer basis. Parents who have come through Families in Care often stay and help other parents going through the same situation that they have previously been in. This is because, as my constituent put it, sometimes a social worker doesn't look at things from the same perspective as a parent does. Madam Deputy Speaker, Families in Care epitomise the value of peer-to-peer mentoring. But I must say that there is still much more that can be done to support victims, particularly victims of domestic abuse, through the adoption and care process. One constituent told me that she was refused a picture of her child when the adoption process had been completed. And I'd like the Minister to explain to me why that would be the case, especially when this parent had been subject to domestic abuse and was a victim of coercive behaviour. And I'd also like to ask the Minister what support the government has or is planning to introduce to support birth parents through the adoption process. Families in Care clearly provide a unique and vital service to birth parents in Newcastle. Not surprisingly, they are overwhelmed by demand, both in Newcastle but also beyond, far beyond. Their funding and their support is confined to the City of Newcastle, but the demand is not. I know that work has been done to explore the sharing of Families in Care expertise with other local authority areas. Families in Care have been working with a family court judge, Stephen Wildwood, in Avon, North Shropshire, to see where their model may be best placed to succeed elsewhere, as well as in Newcastle. But they receive consistent and growing demand for their services from all across the country. And given the trends in child social care, which I have outlined, I would like to ask the Minister if she will work proactively with Families in Care to identify and assess areas of the UK in which their model can be used, can be adapted to make a real difference to parents. Will the Minister's Department work with Families in Care to assess the value of peer-to-peer mentoring for birth parents of children in care and take that assessment forward to share across government departments? And in researching this debate, I found it hard to find to find robust and nationwide data on birth parents. So, for example, in trying to assess the average educational status, or whether the impression that, for example, adoptive parents tend to come from the middle classes, but birth parents tend to come from the working class, whether that impression had robust data underneath it. I found it hard to find that data. I would like to ask the Minister whether she will, in her response, let me know if that data is available, and if it is not available, whether she will put in place a programme to collect it. We need to know more about the reasons for which and the likelihood of parents giving up or having to have their children taken away from them to be adopted. But most importantly, can I ask the Minister to assure me that she will put in place a plan of support to ensure that birth parents, wherever they are in our country, receive the peer-to-peer support they need? Thank you.